Delani, thank you very much for this question. I really enjoyed answering this question. When you're answering questions regarding urban problems, keep in mind social, economical, environmental consequences, the problems that we experience because of overcrowding, because of congestion. Our next question comes from Tetletlo, and it's regarding our settlement hierarchies. Now, if we quickly have a look at it, once again, a diagram has been added, figure 4.1. Now, how do we define settlements? First of all, we define settlements. What is a settlement? Is where people live. And in the couple of previous episodes, we looked at rural settlements as well as urban settlements. Now, if you look at settlements hierarchies over there, this is a combination of the different types of settlements that we can discuss. Now, first of all, the first three is an isolated farmstead, a hamlet, and a village. Very importantly, those are rural settlements. Now, grade 12s, we've discussed it in the previous lessons. What is rural settlements? It's usually unifunctional. It only focuses on one activity, and it's mostly primary activities. Let's just mention also it's unifunctional. And when we look at primary activities, what can we say? We look at fishing, farming, forestry, and mining. Now, if we move up with our settlement hierarchies, we've got a small town, towns, cities, large cities, and conurbations. Now, immediately, a town is the smallest type of urban settlement. When we look at these settlements as mentioned on the top half of this triangle, we can classify them as urban settlements. And let's just revise. What did we say is urban settlements? Urban settlements is multifunctional. They don't only have one function, they have quite a few functions. So urban settlements is multifunctional and they concentrate on secondary and tertiary activities. Now, just to give you an example from each of these activities. If you look at the primary activity, it's a farmer, farming crops. What's a secondary activity? It's usually manufacturing. It's taking these crops as an example, and where they make bread from it. That's the example. And once they take the bread, tertiary, pick a pay, checkers, and they sell it. Tertiary activity, for instance, a school, service delivery. Another example I can give you, for instance, mining. Platinum mining is a primary activity taking place. Secondary activity is the manufacturing of steel from the platinum or making industrial equipment. Tertiary is selling it and providing services to the people who actually uses it. Okay. Going back to our questions. If you look at it, they refer to the settlement hierarchy in figure 4.1 that shows you the different classifications of different types of settlements. Choose the correct answer for those given in brackets. Now, if you look at an isolated farmstead, is it a single or multiple buildings? And isolated, what does isolated means? It's all by itself. Now, isolated farmstead is usually rural areas where there's only an infrastructure house on a very big piece of land. Now, if you can remember, we discussed it a couple of lessons ago. If you look at isolated farmsteads, it's usually situated on rural settlements and usually we refer to as dispersed patterns. Okay, so the farmsteads are usually very far from one another, probably because of the site of the area. It might be because it's got very good fertile soil. It's usually commercial farming taking place, farming to make a profit. So as an isolated farmstead, you're very far from your closest neighbor. And there's usually single-story buildings. You will usually just find a family living there, not much more than that. If we go to our next question, the number of settlements increases or decreases as you move up the settlement hierarchy from the isolated farmstead to the conurbation. Now the answer is on the diagram itself. As you can see, number of settlements and the size of the population. But let's go back to, before I'm going to continue with the question, we do not find many conurbations. In fact, we only have one in South Africa, massive one, Gauteng, PWV. What does PWV stands for? Pretoria Witwatersrand Vereniging. Now, before I want to answer this question, just look at the concept of conurbation. Now, very importantly, grade 12, you need to understand your different concepts. Now, what is a conurbation? I will give you a definition straight away. It's many towns and cities merging together. And the best example I can give you is PWV. PWV, especially, that's our next topic. That's one of your topics after settlements. We're going to look at our economic activities in South Africa. And the biggest economic activities is the PWV. It stands for Pretoria Witwatersrand. I always tell my learners, easy way to remember Witwatersrand, if you think about Wits University. And lastly, Vereniging. Now, coming back to the concept, the definition of a conurbation. It's many towns and cities merging together, like the PWV. These towns include Pretoria Witwatersrand. Witwatersrand means we're talking about Alberton, Randburg, Benoni, etc. So it's many small towns and cities that basically merge together. A very good example, for instance, is between Johannesburg and Pretoria. If you go back 30, 40 odd years old, there was veld between Johannesburg and Pretoria. These days, when you travel by car, it feels like you're never leaving the city because you've got Midrand in between, Centurion that was expanding, etc. So it's a conurbation. Now, we do not find many of these types of settlements in South Africa. So if we go back to our image, as you can see, the number of settlements, we do not find many conurbations. How many large cities do we actually find in South Africa? Bloemfontein, Durban, Pinetown, it might be a conurbation, but not exactly. East London, Port Elizabeth, Kimberley, cities, good examples like Welkom, Rustenburg, towns, many of them. As you can see, we do not find many major cities, but isolated farmsteads, hamlets, and villages that are scattered all over South Africa. So as you can see, the number of settlements increases when it's tiny in the size of the population. But the number of settlements with a huge amount of people living in them are less. So if we go back to our question, the number of settlements, does it increase or decrease as you move up the settlement hierarchy? Now, the number of settlements will decrease when you move, just want to use a different color pen, up the settlement hierarchy. So that's the correct answer. Now, if we look at the next question, 4.1.3, the size of the population, does it increase or decrease as you move down the settlement hierarchy from a conurbation to an isolated farmstead? Apologies. If you look at the size of population, what does the size of population mean? How many people live there? Now, how many people do you think live in an isolated farmstead like I've shown you here? Probably the farmer and his family. Probably 4 to 5 people, including his workers, up to 10 to 15. If you go to a conurbation, for instance, PWV, how many people live in a conurbation such as the PWV, Pretoria Witwatersrandvereniging? I'm just going to take a guess wildly. I'm just going to use the whole, basically the population of Gauteng, and we're looking almost at 8 to 9 million people by itself. So if you look at the answer, the size of the population increases as you move. No, apology. The size of the population decreases down the settlement hierarchy from a conurbation to an isolated farmstead. So decreases is the correct answer. If you look at the next question, 4.1.4, a large city can also be called a metropolis or a megalopolis. We do not have them in South Africa. We do find them on the east coast of America, where we find Washington, New York, and Boston, or we find them on the west coast of America, Northern America, where we have Los Angeles, Las Vegas, Santa Barbara, and these areas. Tokyo can also be seen as a megalopolis, but a city can also be known as a metropolis, so that's the correct answer. If you look at question 4.1.5, the settlement hierarchy in figure 4.1 is a South African example of a settlement hierarchy as the largest or smallest of all the settlements. Now, which one is the largest or the smallest? Definitely the largest, as you can see, because it goes all the way up to a conurbation. And I gave you a beautiful example of the PWV. If you look at question 4.1.6, the only example of a conurbation in South Africa, I've mentioned this a couple of times, is the PWV. What does it stand for? Pretoria Witwatersrandvereniging. Now, quite important, that's going to be our next topic after settlement, our industrial regions. I just want to touch base with it. We got 4 of them. We got PWV. We have Durban Pinetown. We have the Southwestern Cape District. And lastly, we have the Port Elizabeth Uitenhage District. I'm jumping the gun a bit over here, but these 4 industrial areas are one of the main topics that we're going to discuss in the next course, next couple of weeks. If we look at 4.1.7, the relationship between the size of the population and the number of settlements is directly or indirectly proportional. Indirectly, because if you look at it, the size of the population is tiny, but we have more of them. If you look at the conurbations, the size of the population is huge, but we only have a few of them. Our last question that I quickly want to discuss is 4.8. The hamlet or small town is an example of a rural settlement. Now, before we answered any of the questions, we identified that the 3 bottom settlements can be classified as rural settlements because it's mainly unifunctional. And those are the isolated farmstead, hamlet, and the village. So the correct answer over there will be the hamlet will be classified as a rural settlements.